Today, we're going to take a look at lipids, which are also known as fats. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to compare the structure and function of lipids and identify common lipids like the phospholipid and steroids by their structure and function. Lipids contain the same elements as carbs. They're going to contain carbon, hydrogen, and they're going to contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Notice in lipids there is no ratio. Okay, so while they contain the same carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, there is very little oxygen. Okay, does not contain a lot of oxygen. Now, some groups of lipids contain a phosphate. We call those phospholipids, okay? So if it is a lipid with a phosphate, we call it a there it is, a phospholipid. So that is the only time that we see P or phosphate in a lipid. So let's talk about the subunits or the monomer. So remember that monomer and subunit and building block are all interchangeable. They all are going to be meaning the same thing. We call the subunit of a lipid a fatty acid. Okay? A fatty acid is going to contain a glycerol backbone, and here it is. And all glycerol is an alcohol. Okay? It is an alcohol and it is dissolved. You can dissolve it in water. And then it has 3 fatty acid chains. Now, these fatty acid chains do not dissolve in water. And we call that hydrophobic. Okay? So when we think hydrophobic, we're talking about water fearing or do not like water. Think about the phrase oil and water don't mix. That's why, because fats do not dissolve in water. And you see that our structure kind of looks like the letter E. Now, what do lipids do? They got a lot of functions. Their primary function is long-term energy storage. So when we talked about carbs, we said that was quick energy or short-term energy storage. When that short-term energy stored does not get used, it turns into fat. And that fat now becomes long-term energy storage. Okay? We also use it as a form of insulation. The more fat that you have in your body, the warmer you can tend to stay. So you use fats to store body heat. They are used for protection. This is true in the case of those phospholipids and the cell membrane. We do a whole lesson on the plasma and cell membrane, and we talk more in detail. But that's the primary function of that phospholipid, is to provide protection. And they also provide protection in terms of waterproofing. So if you think about birds, notice you don't see birds bogged down when it's raining. That's because their feathers are waterproof, and that is a form of protection given by a lipid layer that's on the surface of their feathers. Some common examples are fats. And this is like animal fat. So this is lard, that hamburger meat that you fried in your frying pan and left and it came back and it was hard the next morning. That is called a triglyceride. The key word there is tri. That means we're talking about 3 of something, and the glyceride is fat. So we're talking about 3, again, fatty acids, okay? So we're talking about animal fat. That's one example. Another example is the phospholipid, and like I said, it's going to have a phosphate head, and then it has 2 fatty acid tails, and they're going to be used in cell membranes. We have oils. This is like your corn oil or your vegetable oil or your canola oils. That is a form of a lipid. Waxes, that's going to include like your candles or honeycombs. Think about how they feel. They have that waxy or glossy feel to it. You have steroids and cholesterol. We know that cholesterol can be bad for you. If you get too much cholesterol in your arteries, it clogs and it leads to heart disease and heart attack. Steroids, usually, we're talking about natural steroids. That is for building of structures in your body. And then you've got your hormones, whether it's estrogen, human growth hormone, or testosterone. They're all water insoluble. They're all lipids. The last group of lipids that I want to talk to you about is the saturated and unsaturated. So we have a saturated lipid that we are going to refer to as a saturated fat. All right, and that means there's no double bond in the carbon chain. So we're talking about that fatty acid chain, the legs to our E, right? So in that chain, we have all these C's. When there is no double bond, all of these are single bonds. So these represent single bonds. If there's only single bonds, then it is a saturated fat because there's no double bonds in the carbon chain. These are going to be solid at room temperature. So now we're back to talk about that hamburger meat. That hamburger that you fried last night and left the pan on the stove and you came back and it's no longer liquid. That's because they are saturated fats. So it became solid at room temperature. And that is usually going to be associated with meat fats. Now, another group of fats are going to be unsaturated fats. Okay. So unsaturated fats are still going to have that carbon chain, but now there's going to be at least one double bond in that chain. Okay? So there's going to be at least a double bond in an unsaturated fat. A saturated fat has no double bonds, and unsaturated fat contains double bonds or has double bonds. Okay? They're going to remain liquid at room temperature because of that double bond. And this is going to be stuff like your plant oils. So think about that vegetable oil or that olive oil or that canola oil. It never ever gets solid. No matter how long you leave it on your counter or wherever you leave it, it never ever turns solid. That's because in its sequence, it has at least one double bond. So when we think about fats, let's associate lipids with some words, okay? So when you see these words, think lipids. The first one is triglyceride. We see triglyceride and we sometimes will see it as a monomer for lipids. But when we see triglyceride, this is going to mean meat fat. That's usually what we're talking about. Fatty acids, that describes the subunit or the building block or the monomer, whichever word you prefer. All those mean the same. Hydrophobic means they don't like water. Water fearing. Okay? Hydrophobic, it is a lipid. If it's insoluble, we think lipids. Insoluble is going to mean does not dissolve in water. Does not dissolve in water. When we're talking about unsaturated, that means it has a double bond. Saturated, no double bond. Okay? So we have no double bond. And then lipids in itself, we call fats. So we got carbs. We think sugar. With lipids, we think fats. So in conclusion, lipids function as a means of long-term energy, insulation, and waterproofing. They are made from fatty acids. They're going to contain the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And remember, they're not in a ratio this time. They're going to have an E-shaped structure with a glycerol backbone and 3 fatty acid tails. And the most important lipids to remember are phospholipids in the cell membrane, and these are for body function. We have hormones, steroids, and cholesterol. And they're going to be used in the body. And that is lipids in a nutshell.